Jamal Carter had always been a boy who walked quietly through the noisy hallways of Jefferson High School, a place where the echoes of footsteps, laughter, and whispers seemed to carry a hierarchy of importance, where some students strutted with loud confidence because of their athletic talent or wealthy parents, while others, like him, preferred to move unnoticed, a shadow slipping between walls. His headphones clamped over his ears to drown out the voices that sometimes cut too deep, voices that questioned what he was doing in advanced classes, in honors programs, or even in the music room at all. At 16 years old, Jamal had already grown used to the assumptions people made about him simply because of the color of his skin and the fact that he lived on the poorer side of town, in a neighborhood that teachers whispered about but never visited. A neighborhood where cracked sidewalks and boarded-up houses stood like scars on the city's surface, but what most didn't know, and what Jamal himself rarely shared, was that inside that small apartment he called home, tucked away in the corner of their modest living room, sat an old upright piano, its wooden frame scratched and faded, its ivory keys chipped and yellowed with age, a relic his mother had rescued years ago from a church that had been shutting down, a relic that became the centerpiece of his world, the one place where his silence became sound, where his emotions could spill out without judgment, where every late night after homework and chores he would sit and teach himself to play by ear, mimicking songs he heard, creating melodies that spoke his truth better than any words ever could. His mother, Angela Carter, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, coming home exhausted but always pausing at the door to listen when she heard her son's music floating through the apartment, her tired face softening with pride, whispering prayers that one day the world would see what she saw in him. A gift, a light, a miracle born of struggle, but outside those four walls, Jamal never showcased this side of himself. He never bragged about his ability, never told teachers that while other kids struggled to read notes, he could play entire symphonies by memory, never told classmates that the piano was not just an instrument but a language he had mastered through relentless practice, pain, and passion, because he knew that in a world quick to judge, showing his hand too early might only invite more mockery, more dismissal, more doors closed in his face. So he stayed quiet, blending into the background of Jefferson High's crowded classrooms, until the day everything changed in Mrs. Keller's music class, a day that began like any other, with the dragging sound of chairs scraping linoleum, the chatter of students comparing weekend stories, the smell of pencil shavings and old textbooks, and the sharp click of Mrs. Keller's heels as she strode in, her presence commanding immediate silence, for she was not the kind of teacher students loved, she was the kind they feared, respected reluctantly, and mocked behind her back, a middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, expensive jewelry, and an air of superiority that filled the room like heavy perfume. A woman who had studied classical music in Europe in her youth but ended up teaching at a public high school she clearly considered beneath her talents, often reminding students of her own accolades while dismissing theirs. To her, music was not about soul or story. It was about technique, pedigree, and who looked like they belonged in the world of Mozart and Beethoven, and Jamal, quiet, hoodie-wearing, brown-skinned Jamal, was someone she had long decided didn't fit, though she never said it outright. She let it show in small, cutting remarks, in the way she overlooked him when asking for volunteers, in the way she raised her eyebrows when he turned in perfect theory homework, as if questioning whether he had really done it himself, and on this particular morning, as she scanned the classroom with narrowed eyes, her gaze landed on him with a spark of disdain masked as amusement, the kind of look predators give when they spot easy prey, and she smirked, tapping her fingernails against the piano lid, letting the sound echo until the class quieted, and with a voice dripping with condescension she said, well, Jamal Carter, you've been awfully quiet back there. Why don't you come up here and show us your musical abilities? Unless, of course, you've never touched a piano before, her tone light, feigning innocence, but everyone in the room knew it was not a real invitation but a challenge designed to embarrass, a setup cloaked as a joke, and the class erupted in giggles, some students nudging each other, whispering, waiting for the moment he would refuse or stumble, because that was what usually happened to kids singled out by Mrs. Keller. She had a way of making even confident students shrink, and Jamal was the opposite of confident, or so they thought. He sat still for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, his throat dry, because every instinct told him to keep his head down, to laugh it off, to say, no thanks and retreat into the safety of invisibility, but something inside him shifted that morning, something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the accumulation of years of silence, maybe it was the image of his mother's face listening proudly to his music at home, maybe it was the simmering anger at being underestimated again and again, or maybe it was simply the fact that he was tired of hiding, tired of letting others define his worth, and so, before he could overthink it, Jamal stood up, the room instantly falling into a hush, as if no one had expected him to accept the dare, and he walked slowly to the piano, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes steady, a storm building behind them. Mrs. Keller smirked, certain that she had him cornered, certain that she would watch him fail, stumble, prove her point, but when Jamal sat down on the hard wooden bench and lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys, a strange calm settled over him, the kind that came only when his fingers hovered over ivory, when sound became an extension of his soul, and as he pressed the first key, soft and tentative, then another, and another, the laughter that had lingered in the air dissolved, replaced by a hush so complete you could hear the clock ticking on the back wall, and then, without warning, his hands took flight, cascading across the keyboard in a whirlwind of notes, weaving together fragments of Chopin's nocturnes, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and then sliding seamlessly into a jazz improvisation that burst with life and color, his fingers moving faster and faster, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the classroom, until it pressed against the walls and seeped into the bones of every student sitting frozen in awe, their mouths open, their eyes wide, because what they were hearing wasn't just talent, it was genius, raw and unfiltered, a symphony of pain, hope, and beauty unleashed in real time, and for those minutes, Jamal wasn't the quiet boy in the back of the class, he wasn't the target of a cruel joke, he was a maestro, a storyteller, a master of an art that transcended race, class, and expectation, and when at last the final note lingered in the air, trembling like the echo of a heartbeat, Jamal lifted his hands slowly from the keys, the silence that followed almost deafening, until suddenly a single clap rang out, then another, and another, until the entire class erupted in applause, cheers, even whistles, students standing to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, as if they had just witnessed something holy, something unforgettable, and at the front of the room stood Mrs. Keller, her face pale, her smirk erased, her body rigid as if turned to stone, for the joke she had intended to humiliate him had backfired in the most spectacular way, exposing not Jamal's inadequacy but her own blindness, her own prejudice, and though she opened her mouth as if to speak, no words came out, because what could she say in the face of such undeniable brilliance, brilliance she had tried to mock, brilliance that now stood towering over her, and Jamal, rising from the bench, looked her in the eyes for the first time, his voice calm, steady, yet carrying the weight of every unspoken truth he had ever swallowed, and said, "Music doesn't care what you look like, ma'am, it only cares about the heart you put into it," before walking back to his seat as the applause swelled again, leaving Mrs. Keller frozen in silence, the students buzzing with newfound respect, and Jamal, for the first time in his school career, felt the chains of invisibility break, felt the world see him not as a stereotype or a shadow, but as the prodigy he truly was, though deep down he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine, but for that moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to smile faintly, to savor the taste of victory, for his music had spoken where words had failed, and it had spoken loud enough to change everything.